there was an execution in Missouri this week. A man named Marcellus Williams was executed by lethal injection. Um, and he had been convicted over 20 years ago of a murder. And as they finally moved towards bringing the sentence, the execution sentence, to be achieved, there was a flurry of legal appeals involving the Missouri Supreme Court and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court, all of which were denied. And the Attorney General let the prison know they could go forward. Well, since then, there's been a lot of stories how horrible this is, because somebody in the prosecutor's office and other people have said it should have been thrown out on two grounds. And it's really interesting if you want to examine the grounds. There was a lot of evidence that connected him to the crime. He was in possession of property of the murder victim. One person testified that the computer of the murder victim was sold to them. His girlfriend saw him in bloody clothes that he threw away. There was a lot of evidence linking him to it. The two objections to why they say, well, notwithstanding a trial by jurors finding him unanimously guilty, as well as multiple levels of appeal being rejected, are twofold. One, a prosecutor struck one of the jurors because of their race. Now, the way it works when you're forming a jury for a criminal trial, that the lawyers can ask questions, and the judge can say, "Well, no, you're biased. You can't be in the jury because you basically say, like, I think anybody accused of a crime must be guilty," or I believe whatever the police say. Things like that. Well, you can't be impartial. But each side, the prosecutor and the defense, and this varies a little bit state to state in terms of the number, but get a certain number of strikes of people. They can just say, you're in the jury pool, but I can't explain it. I can't argue to the judge, because I can always argue to the judge, listen to what the person's answer is, but I just get a bad feeling. And again, because a criminal trial is so serious, and the consequences, particularly in a capital one, are so serious, that you get a limited number where you just say, I just want that person dismissed. Well, now they have some secondhand reports from somebody in the prosecutor's office that maybe one of the reasons, not the only, but one of the reasons the prosecutor dismissed this one juror is because he was black, like the victim, not the victim, the accused. Again, maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but the fact that a certain juror was not allowed on the jury doesn't mean that the 12 people on the jury had anything wrong with them. The second thing they argued is they did find the murder weapon, the knife. And they wanted to argue it was inconclusive DNA evidence of whether this man, Williams' DNA was on the knife. But they wanted to argue, well, it proves he's not the murderer because there's other people's DNA on the knife. But what came out is that apparently the knife had been mishandled. It was touched without gloves by multiple people, police officers, prosecutors, before the DNA samples were taken. And so, yes, there were many people's DNA on the knife. The fact of that, because they didn't use the knife to prove he was guilty, they didn't say his DNA is the only DNA on this knife, therefore he's guilty. Again, all the appellate courts have said, okay, maybe there's a bunch of DNA on there, others than his, but that doesn't prove or disprove that he is or is not the murderer. And the jury was not allowed to consider that kind of thought. They were just given the other evidence, some of which I alluded to. So it's kind of a very weak case for arguing this person's clearly innocent, shouldn't be executed. But what's more interesting about the story, I think, has been some of the Catholic reaction, that death penalty is immoral, is against the natural law, and therefore, an innocent person might be killed, so he should have been spared just because nobody should be killed. And this is not Catholic teaching. Again, the fifth commandment is a bar of murder, which is the unjustified killing of the innocent. The Bible doesn't say all killing is immoral. In fact, God tells the Israelites to go kill people sometimes. God cannot order you to commit a sin. He is their enemies. He says you need to go fight your enemies. So killing in war, for example. Self-defense, another example. But it is the unjustified killing of an innocent. That's why abortion is always murder, because a child can't be guilty of anything. They're below the age of reason. But the justified killing of a guilty is not murder. Now, who is the only one that can inflict the punishment of death? God. God is the one who creates life, it is his. However, just like if you've watched our legal series on the premium channel, we've talked about God as the source of all law. God has this authority, but he has delegated to the legitimate powers, secular powers, his authority over life to punish the wrongdoers in this life to the extent necessary for the common good. And some of that necessary for the common good may be multiple reasons: deterrence, protecting the community against someone who is extremely dangerous, various reasons. But the state does not act on its own authority. It acts on the authority of God over life. That's why it's not the same as abortion, because it is not the killing of the innocent. It is the legitimate exercise of divine authority over the guilty. Now, there must be certain safeguards and procedures in place to make sure the person is really guilty. Unlike God, who is omniscient, the state is not omniscient. They can make mistakes. That's why the church has always said that there need to be certain procedural safeguards. And this goes back long before the Constitution of the United States about a trial, particularly when the penalty is death. And there needs to be opportunities for review, to test the result of the trial, allow the defendant to confront witnesses, to present their own evidence, etc. But when these are all in place to minimize the possibility of an innocent person being punished, again, not impossible, but to minimize it, because we're not omniscient. But the death penalty is a legitimate exercise of God's authority and therefore cannot be denied in principle. And it's really interesting how this case has brought out these sort of strange reactions, almost on the level of the NAACP, who basically said another black person was lynched in Missouri. Well, that's really unfair. First of all, he was not lynched. He was not hung. Secondly, a lynching, what is evil about a lynching? It is mob justice. It is people taking the law, not the legitimate authorities, into their own hands without a trial, without any safeguards, and killing somebody. That's a lynching. And that's wrong, no matter who the victim is, because only the state has the legitimate authority of God to execute judgment. This was done by the state. There were appeals through every level. And therefore, it was really outrageous to say that. But yet there are Catholics, some conservative Catholics, who've swallowed the Pope Francis inability, but attempt to change Catholic doctrine and say, well, we have to be, we're pro-life even for people on death row. That's not being pro-life. That is not drawing the proper distinctions and understanding of the issue. But what did you think of this case? What did you think of the claims that the man was innocent, Mr. Williams?
Yeah, I think you covered things brilliantly there. I think it's not this. To me, it was pretty clear cut. This man did commit the crime, and he had quite a lot of time as well. I've seen some of the Catholic response was, well, he didn't have enough time to repent, but I mean, goodness, he had he had quite a lot of time. And one of his last words, from my understanding, was his a version of like the Shahada, him affirming Islam. So it's. Look, I think what you said there at the end about swallowing the Pope Francis pill, again, it comes back to this. We've talked on the show before about how not all papal teaching, not all magisterial teaching is equal. And what you'll hear some apologists say is they'll say something like, well, even if it's at a low level, like the catechism teaching of Pope Francis, it still binds you to believe it. However, that's completely not considering the higher level magisterium, which is extraordinary magisterium that the Pope has, when we've seen over and over again explicitly that execution of certain people is tolerable for and even seen as a good for the common good. And the popes have affirmed this infallibly extraordinary magisterium. One last thing I'll give on this is, if you want a good book to read on this topic, there's an excellent one by Dr. Ed Fazer called By Man Shall His Blood Be Shed, a Catholic Defense of the Death Penalty. and that's published by Ignatius Press, which is kind of amazing. You'd think that'd be published by something like Angelus Press, but
Yeah,
yes, it is published by Ignatius Press. There, great book. There, it shows that this is actually infallible teaching. Just because Pope Francis has a whim saying that this is
yeah,
a something he's going to change, you
yeah.
can't change it. You cannot say it's an inadmissible thing to do. So I would go check out that book, and I think you're right on, Brian.
I want to emphasize a point you made, which is really important. And if you want more on this, we did a little video on the orders of the magisterium and what they mean in response to Pope Francis's statements about all religions over on the premium channel. But in that, because many people say that authentic magisterium that is reformable, not irreformable, not infallible, still binds the faithful. The part of that statement they clip off is so long as it does not contradict an ordinary or extraordinary magisterial statement. So the point is, where there's doubt about the truth, where the church has not definitively ruled through the ordinary and extraordinary magisterium on a point, if the authentic magisterium proposes something, it's not irreformable, they could change later because it's not been definitive. You are bound to accept it because there's no other higher binding authority. You are never bound to accept it when the ordinary magisterium, which is always and everywhere before John Paul II, taught this on the death penalty. And that's the distinction. The part of that you're bound by authentic magisterium they leave out. So
Exactly.
very important.